Computer science. We're going to talk about for loops again. Didn't we already talk about for loops? We did. We talked about for each loops, but now we're going to talk about regular for loops, the OG. So a regular for loop looks like this. There's a whole bunch here. You do have to memorize this. And what I like to do is just memorize an example. For instance, this example. Memorize it like you would memorize a poem or something. For int I equals 0, semicolon, I less than 10, semicolon, I plus plus. And then whatever, it goes in the middle. You don't have to memorize that part. But that header part you want to memorize. And each piece has a meaning. And depending on the problem you're solving, you might change some of these pieces around. But if you've memorized one example, you can write that out and then make your adjustments to that, which is a real easy way to get your for loops right every time. And so you can see here, I've written down kind of what the for loop does. So for I, so this is how you can like read it. So for I, we're declaring a variable called I. Starting at 0, we assign it the initial value 0. As long as I is less than 10, then we're going to print the value of I, right? In normal code, we would do probably something more complex here, but in our example, we're just printing the value of I. And then we increment I, and then we check our condition again if I is less than 10. So that's the order. I'm going to go back and we're going to look at this again. So here, this is the order that the for loop is executed in. We declare the variable I. We assign that variable its initial value. Then we check our condition. Is I less than 10? It should be. We just created it. It's 0, right? We print it, and then we increment it by 1, and then we check the condition again. And if that condition is true, we run the body, we increment it, we check the condition. We run the body, we increment it, we check the condition. If the condition was false, we would not do the body, and we would just go on with our code, just like an if statement or like a while loop. But that's the order this goes. So here's a more generic form of the syntax. So we have our for in our parentheses, and we initialize a counter. So I is our counter variable. We have a condition. So it's something, a Boolean expression that evaluates a true or false. And then we increment our counter somehow. And then a body, the code that we want to do. So with a for loop, this counter, it's a number, right? So here's an example for I equals 0, as long as I is less than 5, I plus plus. This is going to run a whole bunch of times. And it's going to run this body a whole bunch of times. And as it runs that body, I will change. The value of I keeps changing until I is no longer less than 5. So the smallest value I will be is 0, because that's what I set it to, 0. I keeps getting bigger by 1 as long as I is less than 5. So the largest value of I that runs in here will be the largest value that is less than 5. 4 is the largest number that is less than 5. So the smallest value I will be is 0. The largest value it will be is 4. And so this code will output 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Because each time it iterates, it increments I by 1. Starts at 0, plus 1, plus 1, plus 1, plus 1. And all this code is doing is printing the value of I. Pretty straightforward. So that's a regular for loop. So let's talk about the differences between a for loop and a for each loop. Anything you can do with a for each loop, you can do with a for loop. It just takes a little bit more code. But there's some things you can do with a for loop that you cannot do with a for each loop. If you remember, I had a whole list of things you cannot do with a for each loop. You can do all those things with a regular for loop. So I've got the syntax here, right? The for each loop is less syntax. For type var colon list, for int I equals 0, I less than limit, I plus plus, right? It takes less typing to get a for each loop done. A for each loop iterates over every element of an array list. A for loop iterates over a bunch of numbers, starts at 0 and you just keep adding to it, right? So that's a huge difference. The for each loop is iterating over elements of a list. A for each loop is incrementing numbers. It's basically counting, right? Loop 5 times. That's it. And tell me how many times you looped. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The for each loop always starts at the beginning of the list. The for loop, you can specify what number you want to start at. If I don't want to start at 0, I could say I equals 12. I could say I equals -16. You get to pick where do you want that loop to start. Almost always we start at 0, But for any particular problem you're trying to solve, you might want to start somewhere different. You can. You get to decide where that loop starts. The for each loop always stops at the end of the list. It starts at the beginning and it goes all the way to the end. The for loop, you specify where to end. You get to decide where to start, I equals wherever you want to start, and you specify this condition when it should end. So you basically get to pick that limit, loop while I is less than 15, whatever you want. And then the for each loop will store each element of the list in the variable that you declare in that header. So if you've got 5 elements in list, each one of those elements will be assigned to this variable var, whatever you call it. That doesn't happen in a for each or a regular for loop. All the regular for loop is counting up in its counter I. So that will increment. Now you can increment that I however you want. Here by default, and normally you just say I++, it increments by 1, but you could say I plus equals 2, and you could make your loop go up by 2s. I equals 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. You could do I minus minus and have it count down. I equals 0, -1, -2, -3, -4. Whatever you need to do to solve your problem. That's a thing that you can do in a for loop, but you cannot do that in a for each loop. The for each loop starts at the beginning, goes to the end, stores each element of a list into the variable automatically for you. The for loop doesn't have any of that automatic storing of variables. It's just incrementing this number. So you have more control in a for loop, but there's also more syntax to write. And the more you have to write opens you up to the more opportunities for making mistakes. So if you're able to use a for each loop to solve a problem, I highly recommend using a for each loop to solve the problem because there's less surface area for you to make a mistake in. But often you do need to use a for loop to solve your problem, in which case you have to. So let's talk about using regular for loops with array lists. In comparing, I've got two. I've got our for each loop, and I've got my for loop. These two loops do the same thing. Okay, they do exactly the same thing. They iterate over every element of the list, store each element in a variable, and then print the value of that element. Notice there's just a lot more code in the for loop. Both of them declare a variable, string s, that's going to store the value, store one element from the list. And this is a list of strings, so that's where the word type string came from. S is just a variable you get to invent. But you see they both have that same syntax there. They're both iterating over this list, which is called list. So in the for each loop, it's colon name of the list. In the for loop, it's part of our condition. While I is less than list.size. Okay, so while I is less than, we're just iterating over each index of the list. We start at 0 and we're looping as long as I is less than the size, which means we'll iterate over all of the elements. We're printing s, so that's the same, right? That whole line there is the same, the body. And then this is kind of the different part. This line right here, string s is assigned list.getI. This is explicit syntax you need in your for loop that is automatically done for you in the for each loop. This is what the for each loop does for you for free. However, the extra power you get from the for loop is that you know the value of I within the loop. So what this is doing is the first thing you need to do in your for loop, if you're iterating over lists, is get the value at that index from the list and store it in your variable. That's what the for each loop does for you for free. But the power here is you know what I is. You don't know what I is in the for each loop. So as you iterate over every element in the list, you know this is the element I'm iterating over. I'm going to do something with it. In the for loop, you know both this is the element and this is the index where I found it. And sometimes it's important to know where that element is in the list. And if that's the case, then you need to use a regular for loop. If you don't care about location, then you can use a for each loop for that problem. Another thing that you get to do in a for loop that you cannot do in a for each loop is you can specify the range of the list that you're iterating over. A for each loop always iterates over every element. But in a regular for loop, I could say, let's start at index 3 and let's only loop through the first half of the element. So as long as I is less than the size divided by 2 in this case. So we're going to start at 3 and just loop through the first half, not counting 0 and 1 and 2. So that's some more control you have over where you're looping with a for loop. Most of the time that you're iterating over a loop, you want to iterate over everything, most of the time. But sometimes you only want to iterate over the first half or just a small segment, in which case you need a regular for loop to do that. And another important difference is that you have the power to loop backwards through a list. If for some reason you want to start at the end and go to the beginning, you have to use a for loop, a regular for loop, because the for each loop always goes forward. It always starts at the beginning, goes to the end. But this is very common syntax for looping backwards. So it's something else you might want to memorize is what's the for loop header look like to go backwards, because there's a bunch of critical differences between the forwards one. You assign the initial value of I at the size of the list -1, because if your length is 5, your indexes are 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? 4 is the index you want to start at, which is 1 less than your size. So we want to start at the last index, size -1. We want to loop as long as I is greater than or equal to 0. We want to go 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. So we want to include 0. And then we want to go backwards. So we're going to use I minus minus as our incrementer, technically decrementer. Okay, so that's something you can do with a for loop that you cannot do with a for each loop. So yeah, a summary of why you would use either one. It's got a simpler syntax, the for each loop, so less opportunity to make a mistake. And it's a simple way to access all of the elements of the list. It's less to write. So if you just need to hit every element in the list and you don't care about the order, or you specifically want it from beginning to end, use a for each loop. And very often that's all you need. You have more control with the for loop though. It's more complicated syntax, so there's more to write, but you have control over and access to the index that you're iterating over. So you can control that, where you start, where you end, and how you iterate through there. So let's look at how do we write a for loop, just the steps. You can just memorize these, like I said, just memorize that header, but we're going to walk through step by step. So the first thing you have to ask yourself, so this is if we're writing a for loop to iterate over a list, which is most often why you would be writing a for loop. So what list are we iterating over? We need to know both the type of the list and the name of the list. Okay, so this is a array list of strings called blah. What index do I want to start at? Most often we want to start at the beginning, index 0. But if you want to start somewhere else, this is where you would make that decision. So we write for, open parentheses, and we declare a variable, int I equals where I want to start, equals 0, semicolon. What index do I want to end at? If we're iterating over a list, most often you want to go all the way to the end. So we make a condition. This condition will be true while we're iterating, and when it becomes false, we will stop. So we want to iterate while I is less than blah.size. Okay, so as long as it's less than the size, which means it's a legal index. If my size is 5, my legal indexes are 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. All of those numbers are less than 5, which is the size. Semicolon. And then we add the incrementing, I++. So that makes us go up by 1 every time if we want to access everything. Then something you do in every single loop that's looping over a list, you always have to do this step, is get the value at index I and store it into a variable. So string thing equals blah.getI. So thing is a variable you get to decide the name of. Blah is the name of the list you're iterating over. I is the variable name we're using as our counter. Again, I is a variable you can choose the name of, but I is the standard variable name we use in for loops. That's 99.9% of the time I will be your loop variable name. Oh, and then that's what the slide show you here. So string came from the type of the list. Thing is a name you get to come up with, and then that's what you're going to do with whatever you're doing in the loop. We're going to add code here to, in this case, print thing, but you might have an if statement usually comparing thing to something. or whatever it is you're trying to do in this problem. Now this step right here, step 4, is so important. And if you're writing code that's using a for loop and you get stuck and you're like, I don't even know what I'm supposed to be doing at this point, it's probably because you forgot this step. You don't know what to do because you don't have a variable to do the thing you need to do too. If you don't get something from the list, then you can't, there's nothing else to write in your loop, because everything you write is going to rely on this variable existing. If you haven't created a variable to store a value from the list, then there's nothing to do in the loop. You don't know what variable to use. So the first thing you always want to do is get the value from the list, store it in a variable, and then all of your code is going to somehow use that variable. So you can ask yourself, well, what do I want to do with thing? Do I need to compare thing to something? Am I adding thing to something? Am I subtracting thing from something? What is it exactly you're trying to do in this problem? But without this variable, you can't even ask those questions, because you don't know what your noun is, what your subject is in this problem. And that's it. That's how you write a for loop. And that is computer science.